I have a few more of the already not yet handouts if anyone needs them. I'm going to put it up here. I want to remind you too the overarching theme of the handout is Israel's story, a story in search of an ending. So the great question, I suppose, is, has Israel's story reached its climactic point, perhaps not its final ending, but as far as the story as we have it in the Old Testament and the story as the prophets anticipated it, has it reached its conclusion? Now, a significant, if not majority position among American evangelicals is no, that the story is in fact on hold. That while it could have reached its climactic ending in the ministry of Jesus, Israel's refusal to accept Jesus meant that the story would sort of enter into a hiatus period. And this would be the era of the church. And during that era, Gentiles would become Christians, and their life would be related to the heavenly world. Meanwhile, Israel remains in some way, shape, or form constituted as a people, even if they're dispersed into all sorts of countries. And they are waiting for their own story to be completed, which will come, depending on who you ask, within 40, 50, 30 years of Jesus coming again. And therefore, if you were to look at the 9 on the second page, because most of these things are actual on-earth material replacements for Israel's life under the Old Covenant, therefore the future form of them must also be literal material on-earth replacements modeled after their prototypes. Okay, that's, in short form, that's dispensationalism. What's positive about dispensationalism is they're also saying Israel's story is a story in search of an ending. But the way they conceive of the ending is an actual ethnic national Israel re-emerging as the people of God after the fashion of their life under the Old Covenant. So sometime out there, all of that's going to happen again. And if you're at least my age, you remember that in the 70s, that's when I sort of came in contact with Christianity, and into the 80s, the fact that Israel had been reestablished as a national entity, as a nation state, was clearly the kickoff for all these end times events that were just unrolling right in front of us to great fanfare and excitement. I mean, if you hired a public relations expert to promote dispensational theology, you could not have had a better event than 1948 and the United Nations establishing a section of Palestine to be a homeland for the Jewish people, and then B, 1967 during the Six-Day War, when the Israelis retook Jerusalem and eventually determined it to be their national capital, even if that's largely unrecognized in the rest of the world. So what could be better in terms of public relations than the land and the city again, right? That's 2 of the 9 right there. So in my early days as a Christian, we were just sort of waiting around for when the Levitical priests were going to reemerge. There was always some obscure story in a newspaper somewhere that training was already underway for the priests to begin the temple program again. It was only a matter of time before they rebuilt the temple. In other words, the ending to their story was on the immediate horizon, and it was going to look like a modernized version of the ancient story of Israel's life under, say, the monarchy. And then Jesus would return to Jerusalem, and he would take up the throne of David, which is a throne for the house of Jacob, and he would rule on earth for 1,000 years. Now, there are variations to that theme, but that's sort of the substance of it. So what I'm saying about that is, it's a sincere effort to deal seriously with the prophets, that Israel's story is a story in search of an ending. But it's a misguided effort because, at least as many of us see it, they are reading the Old Testament without using the New Testament as a model for interpretation on the Old Testament. They see that as a badge of honor, of course. Of course, that's how you do biblical interpretation. You look at the original text and you understand it literally, unless there are features of it that just demand that it can't be literal. And we would say, well, that's well-intentioned, but we're already learning in the ministry of Jesus that the way this story is panning out isn't necessarily going to look like this so-called literal ending. Okay? Ours is better than that, in my opinion. And it does more justice to all the biblical data. So, anyway, any questions about that? How many of you have had any experience in dispensationalism? Yeah. I don't know, is it waxing or waning these days? It's been a long time now since Israel was reestablished as a nation state. Anyone know? Does it have the level of popularity that it once had when everything was so exciting and new? I'm kind of out of the loop myself, so.
Churches that dispensational still are.
Right.
It's just not. Since the Lahey Jenkins books, you don't hear about it nearly as much.
Right.
Well, there have been so many political leaders that they all were claiming we're going to be the Antichrist. I kind of find it funny that, well, I won't go there. There's probably too many people in church.
My favorite was came from Dr. Charles Taylor. They were all doctors. In retrospect, I'd like to see where their doctorates came from. But he did the math, and he proposed King Juan Carlos of Spain would be the Antichrist. I don't even know if he's still alive anymore. So, all right, well, let's go back to our version. And I gave you an assignment last week. We're looking at the prophets, their office, their function, and their message. And I wanted you to provide the class with references from the Old Testament that fall within the 9 that are the prophets' descriptions of how Israel's story would reach its conclusion. So they're telling the story of Israel now in advance. That creates expectation and excitement. But what is that story going to look like? And how do the prophets create that story? Bob Galt gave us one. We looked at the famous passage from Micah 4, which is duplicated by his contemporary Isaiah in Isaiah 2. And both of them describe the mountain of the Lord. The mountain of, we'll just say Yahweh. That it will be higher than all the mountains of the earth. The temple will sit on top of the mountain. So that implies, of course, that Israel has been reestablished from their exile. But in this time, the nations of the earth will come to that elevated mountain and they'll learn the Torah. And Israel presumably has that place of preeminence in the world over all the other nations, and they are submissive to the God of Israel, that is the nations, and are submitting themselves as well to the Torah. So that's part of it.
Say, maybe to add to that, for the earth shall be full of the knowledge of the Lord as the waters cover the sea. That's the Torah part, the Isaiah and Habakkuk. That's one I thought of.
Okay, so there is a future when God's glory, we'll say it's international. So they envision a breaking out from the boundaries of Israel proper, reinforcing this idea that Israel's God will be the God of all the nations of the world, and if his glory covers the whole earth, like the waters cover the sea, presumably his rule is unchallenged and the nations are entire submission. Kara.
Yes.
Oh, don't you remember when I said, I closed last week by saying everyone has to have a text this week?
Oh, right. I forgot I wasn't supposed to come today.
Oh, okay. It would have been so much easier just to find a text. All right, no points for Kara today. John, I said you were included.
Yeah. Okay. I found something from Isaiah 42.
Oh, you're showing me up, man.
Yeah, that's really, thank you, John.
Okay. How much do you want me to read of this?
Well, you can read what you want and maybe give us your own summary of it.
Okay. And it doesn't have a lot of the 9. It has a couple in it, but...
Of course, it doesn't have to have all the 9. Even 1 is sufficient.
Okay. Behold my servant, whom I uphold, my chosen one in whom my soul delights. I have put my spirit upon him. He will bring forth justice to the nations. He will not cry out or raise his voice, nor make his voice heard in the street. A bruised reed he will not break, and a dimly burning wick he will not extinguish. He will faithfully bring forth justice. He will not be disheartened or crushed until he has established justice in the earth, and the coastlands will wait expectantly for his law. Thus says God the Lord, who created the heavens and stretched them out, who spread out the earth and its offspring, who gives breath to the people on it and spirit to those who walk in it. I am the Lord. I have called you in righteousness. I will also hold you by the hand and watch over you, and I will appoint you as a covenant to the people, as a light to the nations, to open blind eyes, to bring out prisoners from the dungeon and those who dwell in darkness from the prison.
We could even stop there. What from the 9 did you get?
Covenant, people, land, perhaps.
Perhaps.
I think that's all I found.
All right. Anyone else hear something there? That's fine. Okay, so yes, creation, right? Because he's the God who created the heavens and the earth. That phrase almost seems like a trope for us, but in their world, that is the distinguishing feature of Yahweh over and against all the other gods. Our God, parenthesis, not your gods, made the heavens and the earth. And our God dwells in the invisible heavens, and he can't be seen or touched by humans. So I'm going to put Isaiah 42 as sort of a summary statement of all of that, but it also includes kind of features 1 and 2 in the sense that the servant is, in a way that's kind of foggy, he is going to be the agent of justice to the whole world. So once again, the local God is actually the God of the whole world, and the whole world will know that. And remember, we're like in the 3rd century BC, so we don't know anything about Jesus. We don't know anything about Paul. All we know is that our sacred writers, the prophets, are weaving a story together that closely resembles or parallels the story thus far about our life as the people of God, but it's starting to show some differences as well, things that we can't easily quantify. So we're trying to put together the pieces of a puzzle and give shape with the information we have to how we, the people of God, expect our own story to end. George.
Then the Lord became jealous for his people and for his land, and had pity on his people. In response to his people, the Lord said, "I'm sending you grain, wine, and oil, and you'll be satisfied. I will make you no more a mockery among the nations. I'll remove the northern army far from you, and drive the parched and desolate land into its front of the eastern sea and its rear of the western sea. Its stench and foul smell will rise up. Surely it's done great things. Do not fear the soil. Be glad and rejoice, for the Lord has done great things." Do not fear you animals of the field, from the pastures of the wilderness are green, the tree bears its fruit, the fig tree and vine are yield. O children of Zion, be glad and rejoice in the Lord your God. He has given the rain early for your vindication. He's poured down for you abundant rain, the early and latter rains before. The threshing floor should be full of grain, the vats overflow with wine and oil. I will repay you for the years that the swarming locust has eaten, the hopper, the cutter, the destroyer, my great army which is sent against you. You will eat in plenty and be satisfied in the name of the Lord your God, who is well wondrously among you. My people will never again be put to shame. You will know I am in the midst of Israel, that I am the Lord your God. There is no other. My people shall never again be put to shame. So there's temple, people, land, covenant, and then he's mentioning the covenantal obligations.
Right. And what I wanted to stress in that was the end of the exile. Because if the exile is in our rear view mirror, because we're 3rd century BC, and it turned out to be kind of a dud as far as returns from exile are concerned, especially if you listen to George's description of what will accompany the end of exile, right? If you don't have to know very much about the intervening years between Malachi and the Gospels, but they were not extensive periods of remarkable economic prosperity for Israel. Just the opposite. They were times of pagan domination, persecution, civil war, and on and on and on. So it was a grim period of time. So the end of exile has to be kind of the rebooting, I guess, of everything else that's going to happen in the future of our story. Because you can't have the mountain of the Lord with its temple. You can't have God's glory filling the earth. You can't have the servant being the agent of God's message, the Torah, and justice in the world, unless we actually have our land back with all the prosperity associated with that land. So this is a key term, and that's why I used the other color that I have this morning. See? We have 2 colors. I wanted to highlight the end of the exile. Okay? This is the lowest point in Israel's story. It should, by all the indicators of the covenant itself, be the end of Israel's story, except even in the covenant, there were already promises that looked forward to a time when there would be an exile and the exile would come to an end. All the way back in Leviticus, for instance. Okay? So everything else depends on this event. That puts us in a little bit of a tight spot, because if we're in the 3rd century, how are we interpreting our life as the people of God right now?
That passage indicated it's a forever end of the exile. So there's something more.
There has to be. Even if we still can't put it all together, I think after pious reflection, prayer, and conversation among ourselves as the remnant, we have to conclude together that what happened under Nehemiah and Ezra and Habakkuk and the post-exilic prophets was not Joel. So we can sort of cross that one off the list. Carrie, you following me?
Fine.
Okay, go ahead. You can ask.
I don't have anything to ask the primary at the moment.
Oh, because you look like,
Oh, I did?
yeah,
The wheels are turning.
the wheels are turning. Okay, so Jeremiah said, how long did Jeremiah say the exile would go?
70 years.
70 years. So you start a countdown, and where you start the countdown, I'm not interested in the details right now. The fact is, There's a 70-year period that comes to an end with the decree of Cyrus to send the Judean exiles back to their land, and Cyrus is going to provide the wherewithal for that nation to begin rebuilding and putting itself back together again. Cyrus is the anointed one. So we actually have an event in history that we can call the return from exile. It's recorded for us in the Old Testament, but it's so anemic and so disappointing on nearly every score, particularly the fact that if the covenant remains that conditional covenant, what will ever happen to the people who immediately start intermarrying with the locals, therefore defiling themselves and the covenant, picking up where they left off when we were all kicked out? What kind of future will we have because we're the faithful, we're among the faithful remnant? What kind of future will our nation have if we have to live in a relationship with God where our possession of our land and all of its benefits depends on our obedience to Him? He hasn't done anything to deal with what we would call the root problem. So we're still looking for an end of our exile, even if in kind of a plain literal sense, many of us are actually living within the boundaries of our old nation. Just think, this is just story and chronology, right? Thank you.
Yeah, I'm just curious, do you think the purpose of God was ending the exile on one hand and not ending the exile until Pentecost, really?
Right, which is where George was actually going with Joel if he'd kept on reading.
Is it just that he was just showing, I'm still committed to my promises, but I will unfold them with greater glory in my own time?
Right.
Essentially the blessing in the story.
You know, I think, if we're just in the 3rd century BC, I think we wouldn't be quite sure. I think we could say, in a provisional sense, he ended the exile, but all of these wonderful things that surround the end of the exile, and we've hardly scratched the surface here. Right? No one's mentioned anything about a new covenant and the forgiveness of sins. No one's mentioned anything about the Davidic king who will rule over his people forever. Nobody said anything about the mystery of the king being David and Yahweh. I will rule, David will rule. I will rule, David will rule. It could kind of be that tiered relationship of the kingdom of God, but it doesn't sound that way. It almost sounds like the two become one. That's especially true in Ezekiel. But even with this much promised, and we look around and our vats aren't overflowing with oil, and our wine presses are running kind of dry, and the Greeks come in and do whatever they want with us, including spoil whatever's left of our temple, and require us to give up our covenant markers. We have to eat pigs, for instance, under King Antiochus, in order to prove our loyalty to him, and if we won't comply, he will kill us, and so forth. Okay, so this is all pretty miserable, and it sounds like it might even be as bad as the book of Judges for us right now, if not worse. So we've concluded that our story is not over, that this is not what the prophets described for our future. What else do we have to look forward to? Yeah, that one's off the charts, isn't it?
Yeah, if I'm an Israelite, I'm saying what?
Right, yeah.
I created new heavens, new earth, all these former things are gone, and what do you make?
Yeah, we'll get to that in Isaiah, but it's in the new heavens and the new earth, still Jerusalem is the focal city. And in Jerusalem's restoration, even though it's a whole new heavens and earth, Jerusalem remains the place where Yahweh dwells, and it will undergo this wonderful renewal and prosperity so that people will actually live, get this, into their 90s.
What?
They'll live longer than that.
Actually, it's kind of poetic. I think he says something like, if a man dies at 100...
A sinner dies at 100.
Right.
He's accursed.
That's right. So I said 90s because people are living into their 90s right now. It's, from our point of view in the modern world, it's like, I guess that's pretty good. But from our viewpoint in the ancient world, that sounds pretty exciting. People live in security. They live in safety. Things that would have been precious to people in the ancient world. That you could actually expect your God to keep neighboring nations who are envying your prosperity, to keep them out so that they cannot manhandle your children and your wives and steal all of your crops. This is just how life was in the ancient world. We find that in the Bible itself, right? If you lose a war in the ancient world, what happens?
Dead or captive.
And the captivity is slavery, right? So John, Andrew, a couple of strapping young men, we're going to kill Bill. I didn't mean that. Right. It's a Quentin Tarantino movie for the non-hip. But Andrew and John, hey, we've got places for you in the salt mines that you're just going to love. Thank you very much. That's how our economies operate. War and slavery. And I won't go any further with things about the women, but even Israel practiced these things in their conquest of the land. That is, if you don't just decide to kill everybody and raze the city to the ground and be done with it.
Did Israel do it under God's orders?
Yeah.
Most of the time he told them to kill everybody, though.
That's what I mean. During the conquest, the orders were often everybody has to die, which is probably peculiarly related to the conquest because the land has to expel all traces of the people and their lifestyle that had existed there until the measure of their sins were full. Sometimes I think they got to keep the virgins.
And as a type of the second coming, there'll be banishment of all evil and evil people.
Right.
And then placement of the true people of God.
Must they have thought when they read the end of Isaiah 65 where it says the ox and the lamb will lie together, the lion will eat straw,
Right.
scratching their heads.
Yeah, and I introduced this morning with a description of dispensationalism. So, because Israel's story is on hold for dispensationalists, and the future is a literal material fulfillment modeled on the literal material past, That will have to be a key feature of the millennial kingdom. So it's not culturally conditioned language that expresses harmony about the future in the language available to Isaiah at the time. It's just one of the exciting features of the millennial kingdom. So when we all take our kids to the zoo, there won't be any separations between the predators and the prey. Look, Mommy, the lion and the lamb, they share the same space. That's pretty cool, like living to 90 years old. But when you start hearing some of this stuff, the mountain of Yahweh elevated above all the mountains, God's glory covering the earth, covering the earth like the seas cover the, like the oceans cover the water. What is it?
Water covers.
That's it. The other way around. I'm nervous. Little things like my baby can play around venomous snakes and I don't have to worry. That just doesn't seem like that big a deal. I mean, it is cool. Or isn't this a way, perhaps, of using imagery of the time and saying parents who are always anxious for their children's health and safety and have no real expectation that all of their children will survive childhood and enter into adulthood, that you'll just have a percentage, perhaps. It's a world where I can't text Doug and say, you know, my kid has a runny nose, what should I do? What I'm all alone in this. I don't even know how fevers happen. That is a way of saying one of the great anxieties of life will be solved. It'll be settled. To the point, in this kind of hyperbole, that if your little baby strolls out and starts playing with cobras, you won't have to worry. But if that's the best we can do in the millennial kingdom, especially in light of all of this, this is what we're talking about in the 3rd century. Us, the remnant, the faithful, we're trying to figure all of this out.
How much does that drive them back to the creation story?
Yeah, that probably does, doesn't it? That's not a main feature of the creation story, but it's so creation-oriented that it couldn't help but conjure up pictures of the garden. When it appears that there was this wonderful harmony between all the creatures, Adam included. Something else. Paul, did you do your homework? Okay. You and Kara, I want you to stay after and see me. No, Carissa? Okay. Need to come up and write on the board 10 times. I will come with my scripture verse.
Malachi 4?
Malachi 4. We may have had that, but give it to me again.
All of it or just a few verses?
The pieces that you think are the best.
Okay, I'll just do 1 through 3. For behold, the day is coming, burning like a furnace, and all the arrogant and every evildoer will be chaff. And the day that is coming will set them ablaze, says the Lord of hosts, so that it will leave them neither root nor branch. But for you who fear my name, the Son of Righteousness will rise with healing in its wings, and you will go forth and skip about like calves from the stall. You will tread down the wicked, for they will be ashes under the soles of your feet on the day which I am preparing, says the Lord of hosts. So I would say people are in that passage, and perhaps creational.
Go back to Malachi 3 at the start.
Behold, I am going to send my messenger, and he will clear the way before me. Lord, whom you seek, will suddenly come to his temple, and the messenger of the covenant, in whom you delight, behold, he is coming, says the Lord of hosts.
Okay, that sounds good. Temple. But, keep going.
But who can endure the day of his coming, and who can stand when he appears? For he is like refiner's fire, and like fuller's soap. He will sit as a smelter and purifier of silver, and he will purify the sons of Levi, and refine them like gold and silver, so that they may present to the Lord offerings in righteousness.
Okay, so there we have temple and priesthood, which is at the center of our national life. The Lord is returning, but there's also this messenger guy. And in the Lord's eyes, the temple he returns to is corrupt, as well as the priesthood. But rather than judge it, he is going to purify it. So what does that tell us? How are we going to add that to our puzzle? Can we connect it to the mountain of the Lord? Is it going to be a prelude to the elevation of the mountain? Let's see. Can we be looking for someone, a specific individual, whose arrival in Israel will signal that the events that Malachi foretold are now getting underway? So remember, we're trying to imagine our own story, but as much detail as we have, it's kind of hard to put it all together. So it's there, and most of it is very satisfying and creates some enthusiasm in our midst, and yet it's still a little bit fuzzy. What we will inevitably do is put our own interests on top of this story, so that basically we will have a version of the story based on the prophetic information that will be most satisfying to us and seem to do the most good with the information that we have. So if it were a puzzle, it's going to be 87% complete maybe, but with some significant gaps. This gets back to your question last week, Kara. Why didn't they recognize Jesus? Because they have a version of their story, but he only seems to fit parts of it. So now we don't quite know what to do with him. There's really cool stuff, but there are other things that would seem to be out of step with the story as we've interpreted it. Does that make sense? I want you to, our story needs an ending. The prophets are writing the ending, but the language that they use, as familiar as it is to us, temple, priesthood, king, land, city, and so forth, it's also kind of mysterious. And the parts don't come together as neatly and as nicely as we would like. So with our own imaginations and our own ingenuity, we'll do our best to put the pieces together and have our own story waiting for us to be fulfilled in the future. It's what dispensationalists do now. Okay, this country is the country, this is Gog, this country is Magog, the European Union is, I can't even remember, they all have dragons' heads, and helicopters are the UN's way of... in other words, we're trying to imagine what the story will look like historically when it actually appears. And inevitably we're going to be wrong, because there are parts of the story that are actually rather irritating and inconsistent with our overall expectation. Like ellipsis. What parts of the prophet's story are irritating to us and seem out of step with this larger story that we're putting together?
The one that dies.
What's that?
The one that dies.
Who's the one that dies?
Well, I don't know, because I'm thinking from the 3rd century, but if I were thinking from today, I would know who that was.
Right. But good. Think from the 3rd century. Where are you getting this idea that there's someone who's going to die?
Well, Isaiah wrote about it.
He did. In fact, John read to us about this guy called the servant, who's the agent of justice to bring the Torah to the whole world. That's pretty cool. But as Isaiah goes forward, the servant seems to, instead of increasing, he seems to decrease. And depending on how we read Isaiah 53, maybe even die. Well, we're not sure what to do with that. That doesn't fit the larger story. Who could possibly be Yahweh's servant who will accomplish these great things and die? Will he accomplish the great things and then die? Well, that doesn't quite make sense. See how we're processing this? So I think a lot of people just said, let's cross that one out. Let's stick with the good stuff. And that becomes the hole in the story that only Jesus could fill. But it's such an undesirable part of the story that it's easily dismissed.
We're looking forward to God returning to his temple, but Malachi says, why are you looking forward to that? You won't be able to stand it when he comes. You won't be able to endure it.
Right. That's another. The benefit of that story is he's not going to destroy the temple and the priesthood like before. But it does suggest a future where the temple and the priesthood are corrupt and need to be purified, and God is going to do it himself, along with his messenger, somehow. So our whole exercise right now is to imagine our future through the language of the prophets. And I think next week I'll just bring in a few of my own to fill out the balance a little bit, and then we'll go forward into the New Testament well prepared for the already not yet.
The thing is, I think most of the stories back then weren't fiction or futural. They were telling history. They were all about telling history stories. And now we enjoy all sorts of authors that make up all sorts of fantastical make-believe stories. And I'm sitting here thinking, if you think about the Creator God and all the surprises he's had up his sleeve, how could you ever possibly guess the end of the story?
Right.
There's beyond our comprehension.
Right. And we suffer from the handicap of wanting to bend the story to our own advantage. So we're never even reading it without a bias.
Somehow we've got to make it through, right?
Right.
We're not going to be the one that runs out when there's an atomic blast or something and gives ourselves it's just...
Yeah, even today, when the pre-trib people, at least we're not going to be here for all the suffering. which is a great evangelistic tool, if only it were true. All right, let's get ready for worship.